So I have here with me Dr. Michael Ungar, who is, among many other things, co-director of the Resilience Research Centre that conducts and supervises research in over a dozen countries. He is a prolific writer, and here is one of his books, but there are two others that are out now, I understand.
Just came out, one for parents,
and one for professionals.
Absolutely.
Michael, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Real pleasure.
We have to start, of course, by me asking you if you could explain to us what resilience is.
Well, typically, resilience was studied as a very individual quality. It's that notion of someone being able to overcome adversity. And what's been interesting about our work, the team that I sort of coordinate, lead internationally, is that we've begun to sort of broaden that definition to something much more systemic, ecological, social, and begun to understand resilience as the capacity of people, as families and as individuals, to make their way, or how we say, navigate their way to the resources that they need to do well. But that also implies that we as communities and families and schools make those resources available to them to do well. And then you get into, in terms of, for us to be resilient, it's not just about us being able to navigate, to make our way to what's available. There's also got to be a process of negotiation. This notion that somehow we also engage with our environments to say, this is what we need to do well. So there's always this process of saying, for me to do better in life, please give me what I need on terms that make sense to me, that reflect my culture and my values. And you can begin to see that then resilience becomes this very systemic process that implicates everybody in sustaining us after we've suffered severe trauma or been exposed to life crises that are potentially overwhelming.
That makes complete sense, and it's in a way it's odd that we've only just started thinking about it in that way as a result of the work that you're doing.
It is odd, isn't it, that we think that somehow it could just be about individuals, and even people who sometimes will say, of course resilience is a process, but then they only shine the light on the individual half. So we tend to take a child out of their context, give them CBT, mindfulness training, EMDR, whatever they need, and then expect them to return to a very toxic environment, or potentially an environment that doesn't reinforce the very learning that took place in a therapeutic situation. Now, I know that sounds very simple, but actually I think what the problem is that we don't have necessarily the skill set on the other side for therapists to figure out how do we engage in conversations with clients about things like racism and social marginalization, and even just the factors that prevent a child or a family as a unit getting into a therapeutic process. Most of the evidence-based practices in this field tend to have been done either lots and lots of resources to make sure that people get to the therapeutic interventions, or done in very limited places where the clients that showed up were the ones that went through the evidence-based trials.
So we're looking at a tiny piece of the pie, of the humanity pie.
So how do you work with a family that's been exposed to trauma in northern Japan after the tsunami? And does that look the same as a child who's living in the chronic poverty and the violence that they're exposed to in the townships of South Africa, or for that matter in a highly racialized community in my own part of Canada, where we have a lot of tension between people who have African Canadians and the sort of the dominant culture. When in all those different contexts, there are going to be very specific aspects of family dynamics and families' interactions with their broader community, which are going to make them much more successful. But it's not always just about changing individuals, or for that matter, just changing communication patterns amongst families. It's also about ensuring that when that family, as they change, that the environment around them, that the school, for instance, accepts them and adapts curriculum, or for that matter, that the hospital that is treating them has some sort of cultural competency to their practices. Or for that matter, that social policies ensure that that family, if they're living in poverty and have been exposed to sort of chronic stressors, that family also has access to affordable childcare that's of a certain quality, which is really a social policy issue. Now, I'm not trying to make family therapists necessarily into policy makers, but I do think that there are ways of having conversations with people that decenter that conversation so that their resilience is as much embedded in the structures and the systems around them. And this doesn't have to get complicated. It can be as simple as asking a child who has been referred to you because their family thinks that they have a problem with anger, and yet they're being bullied or racially marginalized on the playground. They're being called all kinds of racial names, or they're immigrants who have come to a country and there's language issues and everything else. To not assume that the problem is anger, but to assume that the anger is reactive to a social situation, and to engage in those kinds of conversations and to find experts from their own culture and context who can, in a sense, come into those therapeutic encounters and say, this is one solution that is culturally relevant to solving this. In other words, creating a community of practice, a community of concern to create that resilience in the individual and their family systems.
And it sounds like this really requires some pioneering work around having conversations with people who are policymakers, with people who are school administrators, just to widen their understanding, not to become family therapists, but to start to develop an understanding of systemic resilience, which you're talking about.
It really would be nice if more policymakers were family therapists.
It's quite unlikely.
It's unlikely, but we can get them to think systemically.
Yes, exactly.
And we can also get them to fund systemically.
When they understand.
When they understand. If you contrast, if you looked at, say, families recovering from different tsunami or hurricane events, big weather events such as happened after Hurricane Katrina, and you contrast that to, say, an event like in northern Japan, you'd see quite distinct differences along cultural lines in terms of how families responded and how families, based on the resources and the social policies of their government. Now, as family therapists, we come in, of course, and we have to deal with the family in crisis, and there's a breakdown of communication, and the child's not sleeping at night, and there's all kinds of, all that trauma that's lingering. But do we, as we intervene at the level of the family unit, do we also acknowledge that sometimes it's really about the fact that they're still homeless, or that their community has been ripped asunder, or that their child hasn't been returned to the stability and the routine of a school, and then we're putting the onus on the family to create that routine. When in fact we know from what we know about trauma and recovery is that actually by systematizing a child's life after a major disaster, they settle, we prevent a lot of the sequelae, the subsequent problems that they're going to have. Now, how can family therapists engage in that? Of course, is we become advocates. We help people find those resources. We talk about what is appropriate and what is culturally relevant. In a sense, I do believe that the work I do when I'm actually working with families is to separate the wheat from the chaff, if you will. There are kernels of things that will actually make a difference, and then sometimes there's a lot of noisy other things that are offered that might not make any impact at all. And I do think that families have the wisdom to help decide that.
So is it the family that's bringing that information and really themselves making that distinction between the wheat and the chaff, or is that something that requires a trained and skilled eye?
I think it does take some training. It does take a little bit of that. There are skills as part of the program of research that I've been doing is we've been taking the ideas on what makes individuals and families resilient around the world and adapting it to clinical settings, and then actually getting therapists to try the techniques and then literally filming them to see what would be actually working. And you begin to see patterns. Like, for instance, you begin to see that in contexts of higher stress, you have to talk about the barriers. Now, I know that I was trained as a solution focused, in that vein, and I still hold to a lot of those principles. But I did find that when thinking about resilience, because resilience is adaptation under stress, by necessity, you have to talk about you don't. Well, you have strengths. Or you have strengths. You have something else, but you don't necessarily have resilience. Yes, you're not going to see it. So it becomes you have to talk about the barriers in ecological, like the layers of an onion, of course, right? And there are, of course, that can, you can make people more comfortable to engage in those conversations, even if they're just working sort of, in a sense, the isolation of the family system or the individual. You can encourage them to make sure that they gain the voice of the individuals involved. And I know that sounds very simple. We all seem to do that. But it's quite remarkable that when you actually watch people trying to do this, there's usually an implicit assumption that, for instance, a particular coping strategy is often judged as maladaptive when it could be very adaptive for that particular family if their voice was given a little more noise. If you know, so for instance, a hot one in the United States and somewhat in Canada is acculturation. And I'm conscious that, you know, here we are in Mexico and there's a huge immigration into both our countries. And that's, just think about that, that actually acculturation is well known to be a threat to mental health. That when you have grandparents or parents who come into another dominant culture and they actually acculturate, they're more likely to have mental health problems. And yet, do we listen to that? Do we engage with that and understand perhaps a bit of a social withdrawal, or maintaining their culture through the internet and through, you know, Facebook and all these other technologies? Maybe that's actually going to preserve the family cohesion much better. And yet to the dominant culture it can look maladaptive. That's the complexity of the model, and when it's informed by this understanding and these studies of resilience globally that we do.
So looking at it systemically also requires looking at it from a number of different perspectives in order to really get the complexity.
I think so. And how do you, in a very practical way, as a therapist sitting with your family, with the family as a client, how do you actually do that? Yeah, how do you, without it becoming also a question of, you don't want to privilege highly maladaptive behaviors as somehow, you know, this is not, well, you know, everything is good. There's also an ultimate, you know, the sense of universal by consent, that sense that eventually we do have to reach some sort of compromise. And that's why when we did a lot of studies of resilience, what we found was that there was a constant, people who were resilient seemed to show this pattern, not just of navigating to what they need, such as a safe street, a safe school, a safe family, but also negotiating to get those resources provided on terms that made sense to them. So coming back to the issue of acculturation, there's a sense of, well, on the one hand, you navigate because you want your children settled in an economically vibrant space. It has changes your economic circumstances, if not for you as the parent, but for the next generation. All that's good. But the negotiation part then becomes about, well, if I need to preserve my mental health, I may actually have to resist the hegemony of the culture. I might have to actually resist becoming like the culture, at least for me. My children may sequence that. And this negotiation becomes this kind of very delicate balance. And how do we then, as the people help people to basically negotiate better? How do we help them to engage with the institutions that they're going to have to participate in, to know sort of how, in a sense, how to behave, dare I say. I don't want to necessarily give the sense that you're helping people always behave, but there's always this sense of, you know, you have a value system, you're engaging with the world, what's that going to look like, and how can you be successful at it? And what we understand is that the better people are at navigating, getting what they need in terms that make sense to them, that their tendency to experience events as traumatic seems to decline. That if we look at, like, say, the large longitudinal studies of resilience, what we see is, generally speaking, a very large number of people will show what's been termed minimal impact. They get through, but they get through largely because of social policies and supportive families and extended kin networks, healthy communities, supportive schools, and ultimately,
the way they are in that system.
And of course therapists, that they get access to people who can actually, when there's a little bit of a speed bump, a grieving, a little bit more constellation of events than perhaps they're ready for at that particular time, that there's still those professional helpers and those professional systems to smooth those crisis moments. Give those resources, and the vast majority of people will actually do well despite their traumatic past, and that's us. We facilitate that as part of systems. We make that possible.
Michael, I think this is such important and exciting ways forward for practitioners all over the world. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's a real pleasure to share it.
Thank you.